Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Music Den. I'm your host, Armando Venditti. I want to welcome you to episode 3 of This Left Turn Feels Right. This is where I take a list of artists who, at one point during their career, decided to release one or two albums in a different music genre than what they were known for previous. In some cases, achieving a varying degree of success with these decisions, and in other cases, pretty much dealing with the consequences of these decisions. Now, this band that I've chosen to talk about, there's a lot to cover with this band. So this episode might be slightly longer than the first two that I uploaded. And in thinking about this band that I was going to cover today, I've come to this conclusion, guys. This band has made more left turns in their long career than any other band I know. And that band is Kiss. Forming in 1973 in New York City, Kiss would go on to become one of the most popular rock bands of the 1970s. Some people, or most people, would say that that was due to their larger-than-life stage personas and their live shows, rather than the actual music that they released during this time frame. Although it is worthy to note that Kiss, throughout their career, have released 20 studio albums. So that's, you know, nothing to sneeze at, right? It's a really good accomplishment. And some people would also say that the original lineup, the lineup from the 70s, is considered to be the classic lineup of the band. And you know what? I would have to agree. They achieved a status that no other band could accomplish at that point in time. So, to the task at hand. Kiss, as I said, formed in 1973 in New York City out of the ashes of a band called Wicked Lester. Now, in the original lineup, you had Paul Stanley on lead vocals and rhythm guitar, Gene Simmons on lead vocals and bass guitar, Ace Frehley on lead guitar and backing vocals, and Peter Criss on drums, percussion, and backing vocals. Now, after signing with Bill Aucoin as their manager, they quickly signed with Casablanca Records, headed up by Neil Bogart, in early 1973. And they set about recording their debut album. Between 1974 and 1975, they released Kiss, Harder Than Hell, and Dressed to Kill. Now, these three albums, according to Paul Stanley, sold marginally well, meaning they sold around 50 to 60,000 units each. Now, that's all well and good, but with the stage show that they were putting on, even at that early stage of their career, they needed more money to keep them on the road in terms of being able to sustain them as a live act. So, in the eyes of Casablanca Records, those three first albums were considered to be pretty much a commercial failure. So, after releasing Dress to Kill, the idea was to release a live album, to record their set and release a live album. And at the time, double live albums were considered to be a dead end. Not many record companies would agree to sell or record and release a live album because people didn't buy live albums. Nobody cared about them. But again, the idea was to record a live album of their show. And if it sold, great. If it didn't sell, they would at least have a souvenir of the shows they did. So on September 10th, 1975, we saw the release of Kiss Alive. This thing took off like you would not believe, achieving first gold and then multi-platinum status, featuring a live version of the track Rock and Roll All Night, which coincidentally is still played on FM rock radio to this day. Okay. So at this point, Kiss felt that they arrived. All right. Now, when it came time to record their follow-up studio album, Bill Aucoin took them aside and said, look, you can make, let me rephrase it. He said, you can go back to doing what you were doing before Alive came out, or you can make Alive the start of something. Well, he obviously chose the latter instead of the former. So they hooked up with Bob Ezrin, who at that point had produced Alice Cooper and the Alice Cooper Band, and started to work, sorry, on their follow-up album to Dress to Kill. So between 1976 and 1977, they released Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, and Love Gun. Love Gun and Rock and Roll Over were produced by Eddie Kramer, who had worked with Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, among others. And both Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun saw a more pretty much of a return to roots style, a live off the floor kind of recording, little overdubs, recorded very quickly and released very quickly. By 1977, Kiss's popularity was absolute. People were flocking to the shows. They created a persona for themselves that even they couldn't believe. Okay, they even had what was called the Kiss Army that their fans, sorry, had started up. And also in 1977, we saw the release of Kiss Alive 2, or as I like to call it, Three Sides Alive with Kiss. Now, the reason why they recorded Kiss Alive 2 was they wanted to continue the routine of releasing 3 studio albums and doing a live album. And the reason why the fourth side was of studio material was that Kiss did not want to repeat the material that was released on Alive. So they decided to record some studio stuff in the studio. Sorry, it's been a long day, guys. And they released Alive 2. Now, I've got to say, there's also been rumor that Alive 2 was not an actual live album, but I'm not even going to go into that. Okay, it is what it is. Now, in terms of success, for me, Alive 2, I'd have to say, is inferior to Alive. Okay. Even with all the overdubs and the re-recordings on Alive, you still get the sense of being at a live show with that album. With Alive 2, it just isn't there for me. Okay, I'm sorry, it just isn't there. Now, 1978 was an interesting year for the band. Things at this point were starting to come apart, okay, for the band. Both Ace Frehley and Peter Criss wanted to leave the band, both for different reasons. They were both dealing with substance issues and, alcohol and such. So the idea was to release 4 solo albums, all under the name of Kiss, release them all on the same day. So on September 18th, 1978, the 4 solo albums from Kiss were released. Unfortunately, these albums pretty much tanked. The marketing strategy that they came up with at Casablanca Records, and Neil Bogart in particular, bombed. Okay, they didn't sell nearly as much as they wanted to sell, and there were a lot of returns back to the record company of these albums. Kiss returned in 1979 and 1980 with the releases of Dynasty and Unmasked. This was the first major turn in the road for Kiss. At this point, the band were not getting along. Peter Criss is not featured on Dynasty except for one track, Dirty Living. Dynasty is seen as more soft rock, I guess you could say yacht rock, in terms of the production. The production duties were handled by Vinnie Poncia, who worked with Peter Criss on his solo album. In the past, he also worked with Melissa Manchester. It was also deemed by Vinnie Poncia that Peter Criss was not suitable to record on Dynasty. The major hit from Dynasty was I Was Made for Loving You, a major disco hit. Kiss, Queens are all the same. Kiss had gone disco. Okay, according to Paul Stanley, listening to music in a club one night. He said that it was easy to write this kind of stuff. It would be easier to get a hit in this kind of style of writing than they had with any other type of music they did before. So he wrote the track, they recorded it, released it, became a major hit. To some fans, they saw it as Kiss going soft, as Kiss selling out. And at this point in time, due to the large amount of merchandising that they had started out about a year and a half prior, we're talking lunchboxes, dolls, games, transistor radios. Kiss started to see, Paul Stanley in particular, a lot of younger audiences coming to the shows, and he thought that something was really wrong. So after the success again of Dynasty, they released Unmasked. Unmasked tanked in the US. It tanked. It went and sank without a stone. I didn't even hear about it until around the 1980s, late 80s. Okay. It was a hit in other territories like Australia. So they went on an Australian tour in 1980. It did feature the singles Shandy and She's So European and other songs like Talk to Me and Naked City. But those songs, again, were more in a pop rock kind of vein, softer rock kind of vein. At this point, Peter Criss was out of the band, being ousted by the other three. In comes Eric Carr, but at this point, he was only there for promotional purposes and doing videos. Kiss at this point were at a turning point, a crossroads. They wanted to get back on top of the charts. They wanted to get back in the public eye. The idea originally was to record a hard rock album more akin to what they were doing with Harder Than Hell and Rock and Roll Over, more Harder Than Hell than Rock and Roll Over. Bill O'Coin, the manager, brought in Bob Ezrin, who worked with them on Destroyer, because he thought he knew them better than any other producer, and he could get them motivated to start going because they needed product for Casablanca because they were owed one more album. And even though the band were going to do a hard rock album, they really weren't in the mood to start it just yet. However, after reading a story that Gene Simmons had written in the fantasy science fiction kind of vein, the idea from Bob Ezrin was to do a concept album. So in November of 1981 comes the release of The Elder, or Music from the Elder. Yeah, what to say about this album? This was an idea that, again, the concept came from Gene Simmons, and he and Paul Stanley went for it like you wouldn't believe. And no matter who told them this wasn't going to work, they would not listen. They thought that if they released a concept album, that they would regain the attention of the critics and they would become the darlings of the music press, and that they would gain credibility and street cred by becoming serious musicians, quote unquote. Well, it wasn't until Paul Stanley saw a poster of the album in a New York record store with his hand on the door, he thought, what have we done? Okay. The album did have its singles, A World Without Heroes, co-written with Lou Reed and Bob Ezrin, and also The Oath, which was a single in Europe, and other songs like the anthemic I, which I do like, and Under the Rose and Just a Boy, where you hear Paul Stanley doing a falsetto, operatic kind of tone, which Kiss doing falsettos in their vocals and operatic kind of overtones. It didn't sit well with people, and the album came and went without any notice. And this was the first Kiss album that the band did not do a tour for. They did make appearances on Solid Gold. Now, if you're as old as I am, or even a little younger, and you remember Saturday nights on NBC with Solid Gold, you know what I'm talking about. They basically hit the lowest of the low. At this point, Ace Frehley wanted out of the band. He did not want to be a part of the band. He hated the album. He actually took the album when he heard it at first and threw it across the room, smashed it against the wall, did not like the album. In retrospect, he says this is a good album, but it wasn't a good album for Kiss to make at the time. Okay. Now, they had left Casablanca at the end of 1981. In the early 80s, in 82 to 84, they released Creatures of the Night, Lick It Up, and Animalize. Creatures of the Night, to some, was considered to be a hard rock album, a return to form, with songs like I Love It Loud and War Machine and I Still Love You and Dangerous. And in, in some in some people's eyes, Kiss were back. 1983, with the release of Lick It Up, you saw singles such as the title track, All Hell's Breaking Loose, my favorite track on the album, Exciter, which starts off the album. Kiss were back in a major way. I was going to say main way, in a major way. And they continued the success with the release of Animalize in September of 1984 with songs like Heaven's on Fire and Throes of the Night and Burn Bitch Burn and Into the Fire. I've Had Enough. They were pretty much back. But were they selling in the numbers that they were selling in the 70s? They weren't. They weren't. They continued on throughout the 80s, releasing Asylum in 1985, Crazy Nights in 87, and Hot in the Shade in 89. Crazy Nights was produced by Ron Nevison. To me, Asylum was a good album with songs like All Night, Tears Are Falling. And at this point, they adopted a more glam rock style. To me, at this point, with Kiss, they were basically chasing trends. They were trying to be updated, trying to be relevant in the eyes of the music press. And they were selling good amount of units, like a good number of units, but the albums were not selling prior to the release of The Elder, or I should say, the release of Dynasty. But again, they persevered. After the release of Crazy Nights with singles like Turn on the Night, which is my favorite, Reason to Believe, they released Hot in the Shade in 89, Hot in the Shade with singles such as Hide Your Heart, Forever, which was a major single, big hit for the band. More, again, yacht rock kind of situation. And my favorite track, Rise to It. Hot in the Shade was seen more of as a hodgepodge of an album. 15 tracks in total. Again, heavier sound. Eric Carr on the drums, major increase and boost in the drumming. A major improvement. But the albums weren't selling. Into the 90s, the band would release Revenge in 91, Alive 3, in 93, Carnival of Souls in 96/97, and Psycho Circus in 1998. Now, let me break this down for you. Revenge, again produced by Bob Ezrin, to a lot of people saw a return of a more hard rock, heavier style, more rhythm guitar with heavier drumming, heavier sound, with songs such as Unholy, my favorite track on the album, the first single, Domino, I Just Wanna, and You're Everything to Me, the ballad on the album. Also, with such songs as Spit, Heart of Chrome. To a lot of people, they were back with Revenge. And Revenge would sell gold in the US. Okay. But was it, was it selling as good as the previous albums from the 70s or even the early 80s? No, no. After the single disc release of Alive 3, comes Carnival of Souls, the final sessions. This album, with the one single release of Jungle, not a bad track. Heavy album. This was where the band wanted to be more relevant in terms of the music styles. They wanted to do more of a hard rock grunge album. And there were arguments between Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons as to the direction of the album. The album was produced by Simmons and Stanley, along with Toby Wright, and there were major arguments as to the style and the direction of the album. The album, with no promotion, came and went without a trace. It sank like a stone in the river, and there was no reviving it. They didn't even talk about the album in press interviews because they wanted to focus on the reunion tour. Sorry, got ahead of myself. The reunion tour that they did with the original lineup of Peter Criss and Ace Frehley, and then they wanted to focus on Psycho Circus, coming out in 1998. This album, Psycho Circus, sold more than any of the albums prior in the 90s or the 80s, due largely to the fact that it was an album with the original members. But when you listen to the album, is it as good as, as the albums prior? No. You have the title track, the single Psycho Circus. You have the track Within. You have the other track, I Pledge My Allegiance. And then it came out later in the 2000s that they did not have the original members playing on the album. Only Simmons and Stanley would be playing on the album. But that's another controversy for another day. After the release of Psycho Circus, the band would largely concentrate on touring. And it wasn't until 2009 and 2012 we saw the releases of Sonic Boom and Monster. Okay. These albums were considered by many people as to be good hard rock melodic albums. In terms of the type of music that was on it, the press for Monster, according to Paul Stanley, was going to have all killer, no filler on this album. All hard rock music, no ballads, and he was going to produce the album. Now, after this album, the release of Monster, Kiss basically stopped existing as a studio band. They would not record any more albums. The request or the want for them to record albums was palpable. But according to Stanley, people don't buy studio albums anymore. There was news in the media that, according to Gene Simmons, that yes, we have music, we're going to record a new album. Paul Stanley shot that down and said, we are not recording any more albums, we're done. Okay. Kiss would continue to tour for the next few years, and they would finish their final tour at Madison Square Garden in 2023. Okay. Now, getting back to these left turns that they made, specifically The Elder. Did this album feel right? Let me reword that. Was this album a left turn that felt right? I would applaud them for their, for their want to try and do something different, for their efforts. But overall, when you listen to the album, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad album. It's not a bad album. But when you listen to the album overall as a whole, it just does not stand the test of time, with the exception of A World Without Heroes. I've always loved that song. And the anthemic final track on the album. The album overall does not stand the test of time. It is a left turn that to me didn't feel right. And to a lot of fans, it didn't feel right. Now, you gotta ask the question, had they not made this left turn with The Elder, with the albums that came after that, or could have come after that, would they have continued with the success they were trying to rebuild, or would they have stopped sooner? Who knows? I don't know. But to me, the Elder was a left turn that, in the end, didn't feel right to me. And the band themselves ended up denouncing the album overall. They won't even discuss it. There have been requests from fans in Australia to do shows with them performing The Elder in its entirety. And they steadfast said, no, we're not doing that. The album is not good. We made a mistake and we have to move on from there. So that's it for this episode of This Left Turn Feels Right. Please tell me in the comments below, down there, what you think of music from The Elder. Do you think it was a left turn that felt right? Or do you feel that it was a bomb and they should have stuck to what they were good at doing, hard rock music? Anyways, that's it for now. Again, please let me know your comments down below. Please click like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to keep yourselves on top of any new content that got coming up. I want to quickly thank everybody that has watched the 31 Perfect Albums series that took place in August, and we've enjoyed putting it together for you. We enjoyed doing it. We're going to be doing something very soon. The four of us, we have to discuss that and come up with a good idea that we know you guys will like and that we like doing. So again, let me know your comments about music from The Elder, if it was a left turn that felt right or not. And I will see you soon with more videos. Bye for now.